Hey, I want to thank everybody for coming today. I've been involved in this issue of San Onofre for about 3.5 years. I actually saw a presentation on it right here in this room 2.5 years ago from one of the activist groups called Public Watchdogs, and they gave a good presentation, but it was very technical and it was hard for me to really understand. So that encouraged me to get involved in it. But I've also been interested in the idea of San Onofre being in our backyard, a nuclear plant, and what kind of emergency planning is anybody talking about with protecting the citizens? I was at an event 25 years ago, at a city event, and there were people from San Onofre at a table, and I asked them, what's going on with emergency planning? And they said, oh, we have an emergency plan, it's internal. And I said, well, what do you have for the public? And they go, well, we're not worried about the public, you guys are fine. And I'm like, that doesn't feel like very adequate. So my background in technology was with emergency planning, and so it immediately prompted me to, when I heard this presentation a couple years ago, to try to get more involved and find out about it. And what I found out is concerning at the least. I still don't know what the actual risk of radiation exposure is from spent nuclear fuel. But everything I've learned tells me that there's a possibility of this radiation that's in this spent nuclear waste getting exposed, getting out into the elements, and creating a real problem for us. What's needed is a scientific analysis of that risk. And unbelievably, apparently that has never been done. So I've been fortunate enough working with some of the activist community, especially Samuel Lawrence Foundation in San Diego, to get involved with some scientists who are top-level scientists and are very engaged in this issue, and we are working on a risk assessment project today and hope to have the results of that out in another month or two to give us some really good, more definitive answers on what in fact the risk is. Until then, what we have to look at is what the potential exposures are for this radiation. And we do know that uranium, plutonium, cesium have very negative effects on our human organs, on our body tissues, if we get exposed to it. They obviously can cause cancer. They can cause death. There's a lot that can happen if you get exposed to these. That's why when you go get an x-ray, you have blocks, you have things to block. You're only supposed to get so much exposure to radiation in a period of time per year. There's levels that you're supposedly allowed to have. Otherwise, it's going to have a negative effect on you. This is the issue that we're facing. And people weren't thinking about the waste with these nuclear plants, even if you closed them down. Well, what about the waste? So this is an issue worldwide. You've got 100 plants in the US, 30 of them are now in the process of being dismantled or closed. You've got plants throughout Europe. And Europe is in many ways taking a better lead on what's really to be done, the better way to deal with nuclear waste. So there's some really interesting things you can go see online if you get interested and just kind of do some checks and see some videos of some of the storage facilities that they've created and how they're trying to store this nuclear waste. What we've got going on at San Onofre, all right, we got this?
PowerPoint at least, yeah.
PowerPoint works. Okay, great, that's fine. So what we've got going on at San Onofre, referred to as SONGS, the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Plant, is we've got more nuclear waste there than any other plant of the 100 plants in the country. It is the worst located of all the plants because it's right on the water, and we're in an area of, as you'll see in some of the slides, 8.5 million people in a 50-mile radius, so we're the most densely populated area. We've got the I-5 freeway and a major train, and those are the intersection. Those are the major thoroughways from north to south to get through. So from an evacuation standpoint, from just if something were to happen and it were to shut that down, it would have huge economic impact and consequences. And I'll be referring to several sources of information for you. One that I'm going to refer to is there's a group in San Diego that I've been working closely with called the Samuel Lawrence Foundation. They're a nonprofit. If you picked up some of the materials, you probably see some of their information over there. I think it's Samuel Lawrence Foundation, SamuelLawrence.org, SamuelLawrenceFoundation.org. They've got a couple of papers on their site that I highly recommend. One is this one that they had some folks last year commissioned to do a study from Caltech and Stanford called The Economic Consequences, the Economic Impact of a Nuclear Disaster in Southern California. And this thing looked at what would happen if something bad did happen and we had a major nuclear release. And it calculated about a $13 trillion impact on our economy in our area. I mean, it's massive. All right, and then there's another paper here called San Onofre Nuclear Waste Problem. This is done by two leading scientists, and I'll tell you a little more about these scientists. Tom English and Subrata is the first name. I won't attempt the last name, Chabricati. He just went to do nuclear work for Homeland Security in Washington, D.C. But these are great sources of information about what's going on right now, what's the reality of the situation, what our exposures are. Okay. So we talked a little about where this comes from, what happens. Nuclear energy comes from basically either the splitting of the atom or the fusion, and it drives energy over time, and it decays to a stable isotope, which becomes this radiation. And you hear about terms like alpha rays or beta or gamma. These are different levels of degree of danger, if you will. And gamma are the worst, and they become harder to shield. So we talked about the power plant, and basically, the nuclear materials are in the form of fuel rods that basically are in these generators, right? And then they're pressurized, and then heat is generated. They generate heat by themselves, but there's extra heat generated, which creates steam, and then that is turned into energy that feeds at a very high level. That's basically what happens. And it requires, because they're so hot, they require cooling, and that's why they're put by water sources so that they can have a source of cooling, constant cooling for them. and you'll see that the fuel source is this uranium, several types of uranium, plutonium. There is so much chemistry involved in this topic, which is one of the things that makes it challenging and interesting. It's often hard to really determine truth from fiction on this. In my experience, and now I've been like 2.5 years pretty involved working with a lot of the activist communities, mostly are in San Diego. There's very little activism here in Orange County, and this is one of my issues and my concerns, and one of my appeals to all of you. If anybody's interested, I've got a sign-up sheet up here to say, hey, yeah, I'd like to get either more information or I'd like to become involved in helping solve this. What I found is that it's just normal, everyday people like us that actually are the ones that are going to help and solve this problem, believe it or not. And so it's a fascinating topic. One I truly do believe, even though I'm still not convinced what the actual risk is yet, I don't know that. I do believe that it's a big enough concern that it's likely our biggest exposure here in Orange County. I don't know of a bigger one that we have right now today. So I think it's worth understanding, and it's worth really making sure that we're protected. Otherwise, what's it all about? I'm reminded of the incident that happened in Hawaii about a year ago, if you all remember, when they had the false alarm on the nuclear missile coming in. And there was a big text message that went out by mistake to everybody in Hawaii. Said, hey, in 15 minutes, we're all going to get hit by a nuclear missile. And everybody just didn't know what to do. They had no plan. There was no emergency capabilities. And literally, people were running for the hills. And there were, I mean, stories of tossing kids in storm drains and stuff. And, you know, in my mind, we're in no better shape, frankly. And so, you know, I've met with city officials, I've met with the County of Orange emergency planning people, and we're completely inadequate in that space. It's just, we don't have what we need. This just gives you a little sense of how much of the electricity in the U.S. has been generated by what sources, and you can see that the nuclear it's about 19% right now. Yeah. I read somewhere it was over about 60. And there's still some efforts to try and bring in more plants, as some of you may know. There's some efforts that, you know, even Bill Gates has been involved in a better way to produce nuclear power, right? A safer way while it's operating. The problem is you still have this residual. What are you going to do about that? We have to solve that or deal with it or something, right? Otherwise, you know, not good. This gives you a picture of all the plants in the country. So we've got the two remaining ones here in California, San Onofre and Diablo Canyon. Diablo Canyon is targeted to close now too early, within about another year or two. And they've got similar issues. The good news for them is that where they're planning on storing their waste isn't on the water, as you'll see here at San Onofre. It's actually up on some higher level terrain, which is at least a good thing because it keeps it away from the water. So we've talked about the danger of these elements. We talked about the government committing to build Yucca Mountain and how that didn't happen. One of the problems with these elements is its ability to stick around. It has a half-life of anywhere from tens of thousands of years to hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years, meaning that it's not going away. And so if you were to be exposed to it a million years from now and it was there, it could have damaging impact, damaging effects. So this is not something to be just treated lightly. It's a very serious issue that we got to make sure we're handling properly. We talked about 3.5 million pounds of nuclear waste, San Onofre. This is now where they're being forced to store this waste. The good news is that they closed the plant, right? That's good because it's a lot safer. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima were live active plants. And part of what caused a lot of the damage was that they were nuclear generators that were continuing to drive radiation off into the atmosphere. We don't have that. And frankly, so far, we haven't had an accident from stored nuclear waste anywhere, right? So that's good news. But could it happen is the big question. And so I'm going to talk about some things that we're doing to try and determine that in a minute. But on the surface, the idea, if this is dangerous and if it's not a good thing to have nuclear waste around, it's probably really not good to have it 100 feet from the ocean, and it's only really 18 inches above the water table currently. And so this is another major concern. Because of climate change and sea level rise, we know that sea level is going to rise within 30 to 50 years. These canisters that are right on the water right there, you saw the pictures, could literally be submerged in water. That's not a good thing. They need to be, Salt water. Salt water, even worse, exactly. So this is not good. So we talked about the fact this is a very poor location, next to the freeway and the railway, close to the ocean, sea level rise. We're on an earthquake fault. Several articles just got published on that Rose Canyon fault, expecting, you know, a pretty good earthquake. Whether the earthquake itself actually does damage to the containers, which is a possibility, or whether it creates a tsunami type storm like at Fukushima, what happens there is that the way that these, and I'll have a picture here in a minute of the canisters and the way that they are, the fuel stored today in them, and the way that they are, the heat from all of the radiation is kept cool is through air vents. So there's an airflow, there's vents going through that allow the cooling to happen. And the concern, one of the concerns is that if we have a storm or even a landslide and there's a lot of debris kicked around, that the debris could clog the vents and not allow the airflow and create all the heat to then create an explosion. This is one of the scenarios that could happen. There's also concern, it says not technically defensible. I mean, if somebody really wanted to launch a missile, they could. It's not that tough. This, by the way, too, is the only site that's on a military base. It is actually on Camp Pendleton. This is Camp Pendleton land. Edison is trying to get out of this thing, and I don't blame them. And they want to turn it back over to the Navy, right? and the Marines. And one of the things we've been trying to do is ask the Marines at Pendleton, hey, guys, you've got high ground up here called a mesa. It'd be a lot better to just move it there and let's store it there temporarily, better than on the water. Can't we do that? No, they're not into that. Talked about, this is one of the big risks. You can see in a 50-mile radius, which is pretty much what they talk about. They talk about a 10-mile radius being the immediate emergency zone. So right now, if you're in Orange County and you're not in the 10-mile radius, you're not in their emergency warning system. The only emergency warning notice that goes out, should they decide to release information, if there is a leak that they let you know about, is if you're in a 10-mile zone. But the concern always is, and you'd see it in the video with the plume in Fukushima and everything, I mean, the concern, they typically look at about a 50-mile radius that this could easily happen, again, depending on the wind conditions and whatever. And so this just gives you a sense of what's at stake. And honestly, to not have, I mean, Orange County is more affected than San Diego in my mind. I mean, we're pretty affected. And to not have any advocacy groups or real much activity or anything, I just don't get it. It kind of blows me away a little bit. So we're trying to see if we can improve that situation. Okay, here's a good look at the canisters. So that's actually concrete, and then they get loaded with these metal canisters that you're seeing here. All right. So these canisters have come under a lot of attack. And you'll read a lot about the problem and the deficiency with these canisters. And in my mind, rightly so. Best practices, most countries worldwide, Sweden, France, etc., they are not using 5/8 inch thick canisters that have no leak detection, have no radiation detection, and have no ability to be repaired if a leak is discovered. All of which is the case with these canisters. All right, they are 10 to 20 inches thick, these best practices canisters, and they all have radiation detection capability. They've all got an ability to be repaired, and you know, they're far, far safer. So the question is, well, why don't we have those? Well, that's a good question. And most of us in the advocacy community right now are really lobbying for these better containers. Well, let's get them. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which seems to be the owner of the issue at a national level, although there are multiple agencies that really have ownership, and this is one of the problems, too, with the whole thing, is no agency has full, complete ownership of this issue. The Department of Energy owns the issue of transporting nuclear waste across the country. That's the Department of Energy. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is the one that seems to at least have to set guidelines for what's acceptable and what's not for the plants that are out there. And most of us in the community don't feel like they've really stepped up and done the adequate job of protecting us and helping drive what's needed from all levels, from best practices, certainly across the board. So when it comes to the containers, there's a lot of what happens is see those little triangular shaped things, those are fuel assemblies And so each one of those is loaded with a bunch of these fuel rods. And they all get loaded, 37 of them, into a steel container. And those containers, you can see the dimensions of them. They're about 17 feet long by about 6 feet wide. And then they're put into one of these concrete casks, okay, and then just stored on site. And in the process of loading the fuel assemblies into the containers, they have to be transported from the reactor over into these containers, and I'll show you that in a minute. But one of the concerns is that as they are being lowered down into their containers, which is an effort that requires cranes and everything else, it's not precise. It's not like they're just it's not like you'd see in a movie where it just goes and fits, right? They bang around, and they kind of clang around a little bit, and that can cause gouging and scratches in the sides. And without any inspection ability, without any ability or detection capability, how do we know, right? If those cracks reach a threshold where that becomes a real concern. That's what a lot of the angst is out there in the advocacy community. So when you hear about that, that's what the issue is. 37 assemblies are packed in. So one of the other major problems is that it doesn't appear that Edison has done a really good job at all of hiring trained or professionals, or of training their professionals. So if any of you hear about this near-miss event last August 2018, we had a big near-miss event. It almost would have been a good thing if this would have happened, because I mean, then it wouldn't be a, what might have happened? I mean, we would have probably known what would have happened. But what happened is that as they were loading the canister from the transport vehicle down into its container, there were two operators that were lowering the crank of this thing to lower the container, and it wasn't lowering, and they didn't realize it. So it got stuck on a 1/4 inch of an edge of a lip at the top of the load vehicle, and was sitting there like that for an hour, literally a 1/4 inch away from dropping 20 feet. And this was huge. So not only was the incident huge, what was even more huge was that Edison or the people at San Onofre didn't report this. We had they have monthly called community engagement panel meetings, which are supposedly designed to inform the community and have a dialogue with the community, but they're really not designed well to do that. They're pretty much a one-way presentation on here's where we're at, everything's hunky-dory, and then if the community member wants to say anything, you got a minute or two to say something, bye-bye. There's no dialogue or exchange, or it's just not a good faith issue. And so they had a community engagement panel meeting like within days of this happening. I was actually at that one, and I spoke, as I have at a couple. And somebody got up and said, hey, I'm an OSHA inspector. My name's David Fritsch. I'm an OSHA inspector that works at San Onofre, and I promised I get emotional on this point. I'm sorry, but he said he promised his daughter when he took the job that if anything bad happened and they didn't report it, he'd stand up and report it. So he did. And That's online, and it's worth seeing. And what he said is that this was a bad day, not a good day. So we came pretty close to a major accident. Now, what would have happened? The big question is, right? What would have happened? We still don't know. Edison says we'd be okay. Edison says we have zero risk to the public of any issue. Zero risk. So my issue from day one, as I got involved in this, has been the issue of risk. What is the actual risk? That seems to be the missing piece in all of this. Nobody has been able to really define what that risk actually is. You've got an advocacy community that understandably are very concerned. And frankly, you know, they're out there protecting us, right? I mean, they've got no other reason other than to try to protect us, right? So something's just wrong in this picture, you know. And so I kept saying, we got to do something about this risk. Why can't we get a risk assessment going? Has that been done? I can't believe that there's never been a risk assessment actually done on nuclear waste and what could happen to it. You know, let's get science involved. Never been done. So working with Samuel Lawrence Foundation, these guys that are completely dedicated to this cause, the guy that runs it has literally given, I mean, hundreds of thousands of his own dollars into this, and they've raised a lot of money to support the cause. They do all kinds of great events. They got with me and they said, yeah, you're right, let's do this thing. They introduced me to these scientists down at San Diego. Two guys that I mentioned on this one paper here that wrote up this paper on what's going on in San Onofre. One guy's named Tom English. He's just a top level scientist. He at one point owned air quality for the US. He's a high level guy. He actually had the nuclear codes at one point, working for General Dynamics, you know, with the government. And just a great guy and a great humanitarian. 82 years old, and he's still active, and he's still doing all kinds of things in climate, especially in climate change. But he's been involved in this issue as well. And so I was able to get together with him and this gentleman, Sobrata, who's a nuclear scientist from UC San Diego, now hired by Homeland Security, to begin a risk assessment project. So we've had that underway now for several months. We're able to get a software model from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that they use for risk assessment, but for whatever reason haven't really applied yet to nuclear waste. And we're using that model to run the data, run numbers through. It actually looks at geography, it looks at wind conditions, it looks at a lot of actual variables in an area, and then you can simulate, you know, different scenarios. So we're looking at different scenarios, and we're trying to look at three main scenarios that include what mainly is going to happen if we get a tsunami storm, sea level rise, you know, something that seems to be pretty likely, and then model through their risk, using their risk model, what could that mean in terms of radiation release and explosion and damage. So we're hoping to have that out within another 1 to 2 months. I believe that when that happens, and you know, it gives us the results that we all believe will likely be there, we will have the basis, along with this economic impact study that says there's a $13 trillion hit if something happens, to really take this out and get actual engagement by our state leaders. Because while we've been focused on the federal you know, government to solve this problem, I mean, more and more of us believe that San Onofre is a state issue. It's a California issue. And we need, in my view, Gavin Newsom to step up and say, this isn't okay. We're going to solve this. Okay. So what are some next steps? So we just talked about the risk assessment. Very excited about that. We did some fundraising. There's some companies that are getting engaged in the environment, right? I don't know if you guys listen to podcasts. There's a really good podcast, just came out this month, and I believe it was one of the daily podcasts.
I think it was. I think I know what you're talking about.
Hear about the guy that runs the big investment firm, BlackRock?
Yeah, right. That was the day.
So this big investment firm, BlackRock, that is the largest investment firm in the world and owns a big chunk of a lot of our companies. The CEO puts out an annual letter. And when he puts that out to the CEOs of all these companies that he's invested in, everybody pays attention. And in this latest letter, Virginia, you'll like knowing this if you haven't heard this. Okay, good. He said, you companies have to get involved in the environment and in climate change, and you have to get to a carbon neutral or carbon less footprint. It's a mandate. There's no, you have to do it. And as a result, I think Microsoft has already implemented a huge multi-billion-dollar program. Amazon, $10 billion program. A lot of companies are really starting to get into this. And this is what we need. We need corporate America to get involved in these issues. But a lot of them already have been there. Patagonia is maybe the leading company for this. And so they've got an annual $10 million donation that they give to, they pick 10 different entities in environmental causes, and they do matching funds, donations. So we signed up. We were, Samuel Lawrence was awarded part of that, and we were able to raise the money that we needed for the risk assessment on that, which has just been really cool. We talked about the canisters. So, can we get new canisters? It sounds like, why not, right? But the problem is, there's an issue with moving the fuel assemblies from their existing canisters into these other ones safely, in a way that's protected. It's not there right now. Complicating that issue, the only way that I can see that they could do that today is because the domes that are there still have cooling pools in them. They still have reactor rods that have, these reactor rods, once you close down a plant, have to stay in the pools for some period of time, years, before they're allowed to be moved into dry storage. But at least that would act as a site where you could do a transfer potentially, right? Well, California Coastal Commission, in a big hearing, I think last November, ruled that they're fine to move forward with the decommissioning of the plant and demolishing of the domes, and let's move along. And 50 of us showed up to protest, but that wasn't the right thing. You're not going to. It needed to be done beforehand, frankly, and so that's not good. So I don't know, practically speaking, if this is even viable, but it's certainly something that needs to be pursued. It's something that needs to be looked at. Obviously, we need to find a better storage location. So it seems, Camp Pendleton, the Mesa would be a great first step, but really what's needed, in my view, is someplace in the desert in California that has very remote, very few people that are in the area, we can build a proper site, a proper storage facility, and then figure out a way to get this stuff moved. I think that's really the answer that needs to happen. I don't think the federal government's likely going to come through anytime soon. No matter, Mike Levin has done a great job of trying to elevate the issue, right? And the one thing that he got accomplished for us locally is he got an act passed that said, let's reprioritize the way that the federal government decides to prioritize the movement of waste in plants. It used to be oldest plant first, and he had it changed to where let's have the plants with the most risk, and that's identified by the most number of people around it. If they're on the water, if they're on an earthquake fault, guess who's at the top? We are. So that's done, so that's a good thing. He's doing as much as he can. He got this task force going. It's one of the reasons I got involved with him. And when I met him when he was campaigning, and I asked him, what do you find are the major issues for Orange County? He blew me away when he said, toll road, San Onofre. I go, San Onofre, you're kidding. I mean, I don't hear anybody talking about San Onofre, right? And he's an environmental attorney, and he goes, nope, it's a big issue. I hear it, I get it, it's not okay. So he's been great. He's been leading the charge on this thing. And at that time he said, look, I'm going to start a task force, you know, if I get elected, and I'd like you to be on it. And I've been honored to be a part of that with 30 others from Edison, from the industry, and from, you know, the advocacy group, a whole thing. And that report's going to come out on March 17th, so it's about out. So once it's out, it'll be published. It'll have 30 recommendations. I don't think that anything is earth-shattering in it, but it is going to make a difference. And it's going to help elevate the awareness, which is one of the most important things. And you know, it'll have a lot to say about the need to get the states more engaged. I'll mention one other thing on the political side. In 2012, the Congress actually engaged what was called a Blue Ribbon Commission. It was a bunch of senators and other politicians to study nuclear waste. And they came out with a big report. I've got it. It's on site. I can send it to you if you'd like. It had several recommendations. One of its main recommendations was we need a new agency to deal with this. The NRC is not it. We need to establish a new agency. So that needs to happen at a federal level. It also said we need to relook at the whole storage container issue and come up with best practices. Great, agreed. That was 2012. You know, stuff doesn't move very quick. Certainly if you just, you know, rely on the feds to do it. Okay. I mentioned emergency preparedness. The one thing that all of us can do is talk to our local representatives about this and demand better action. So I went and met with the mayor of San Clemente, the guy that died of a heart attack. I met with him 2 weeks before that, and Steve Schwartz, and I said to him, hey, I'm curious as to what you got going on with emergency planning in San Clemente, because you're like, you know, you're at the mouth of the storm of this whole San Onofre thing. And he goes, it's not my problem. Literally said that. Not my problem. I go, what do you mean? He goes, that's a federal government problem. And I'm like, okay, are you telling me seriously that the welfare of your residents and their safety is not your issue? And he goes, well, what am I going to do about it? And I'm like, I think there's a lot you could do. You know, but that was amazing. I mean, and I've heard that mostly everywhere. So on emergency planning, what you'll find if you look at it, City of Laguna Beach is maybe one of the most advanced in emergency planning. You know, they're on it for, I mean, you know, active shooters and earthquakes and storm. They're good. They put together a new recent 300-page big emergency plan. It's on the website, City of Laguna Beach. If you look at, you know, this document that says what to do in nuclear disaster, the only advice right now is to stay home, stay inside. That's it. I think everybody agrees there's no evacuation real capability. So, you know, we're basically just, I mean, really, I mean, it's a prayer for most of us that don't even believe in prayer. So, not okay. I think that on this space, the thing that we need to look at are creative ideas. In the research I've done on this, the word is, and you remember from way back in the old days when they had these drills on the nuclear drills and people were getting under desks, but shelters are the best thing. Underground is the best way to avoid radiation. So if we're concerned, if the risk assessment says that we've got a major risk and we need to do something, hopefully that will inspire people to come up with creative ideas on shelters, on maybe lead-lined rooms that are radiation protected, on having hazmat suits, who knows. There's a whole range of things that I think we could be doing that aren't being done. So that initiative around emergency planning is a huge one, and it's clearly one that everybody can encourage your city council folks to get involved in. So we talked about the task force, trying to educate the community on the issue. Meetings like this are good and useful. Trying to build an activist group. So again, if you're interested at all in being involved, please come and sign up. we're continuing and trying to connect more with the other communities, with the other communities around the country that are experiencing similar things, so we can share best practices, share ideas, have some networking. But you know, all of this is being done by volunteers. You know, there's no like group that owns this, which is amazing, right? So how protected are we all? It's like Citizens Climate Lobby, right, Virginia? I mean, you know, citizens, this is our job to get involved. And as Rhett's been stressing, you know, it's part of being a humanist is to get involved and just try to make a difference. Well, there's a lot of issues. This is a good one. It's a pretty good one. I find it fascinating and compelling at the same time. Okay. Last thing, talk to friends and family members, elected officials. There's the website for SamuelLawrenceFoundation.org. I'd encourage you to check that out. A lot of good information on it. If you want to kick in some money and donate to them, please do. They're awesome people. Man, I go to events down there in Solano Beach, and it's just an amazing group of just quality people, scientists and, you know, climate people and just, you know, people that are all involved in this thing. It's so cool. I'd love to see more of that up this way. So yeah, that's about it. Any questions? Yes, sir.
3.6 million pounds, is that all just control rods?
That's my understanding, is that that's the waste. That's not the concrete. Oh, he's asking on the 3.5 million pounds, 3.6 million pounds, is that just referring to the waste itself, or is that referring to the containers, you know, or the concrete casks?
Control rods, is there more just like other waste that's somewhere? Where's that stored? All with the containers?
They're all, yeah, it's all going in these fuel rods are actually fairly thin, long, thin, but they're loaded into these assemblies. And there's a bunch of them in one fuel assembly, and as you see, there's 37 fuel assemblies in one canister. Now there's a total of 100 canisters on site at San Onofre. Some of the activists will say that there's enough radiation in one canister that was released at Chernobyl, right? That's what they say. So it's a lot of radiation. It's not leaking out. No, it's all stored. Yeah.
Only steel and concrete.
Yep.
What's stopping it?
Well, they're loaded with it's sealed. They have a sealed container, and then it's got helium loaded in it, which is helping with the cooling. So it's a mixture of helium and air and oxygen. And part of the concern is that if you have a break in the container, and you know, you can mess up the mix of the helium and everything, that could also add to the heat.
Isn't there a lifespan on these canisters?
Canisters have a lifespan of, they say 17 years is the manufactured, and some of these canisters have actually been there that long. Yeah, exactly. That's the point. Some of them, yeah. They claim, oh, they can really go for 20 to 40 years, and really, if nothing happens, the 100 years. I mean, that's what they're putting out there. So part of the problem with this is that Edison has not earned our trust. You know, they weren't honest about the radiation leak when we closed it in 2012. They haven't been honest about the near-miss accident. Who knows what other accidents there have been. They haven't shown great effort with the training of the people. You know, the community engagement meetings are kind of a joke. I mean, it's not good. I'm still trying to actually engage with them. I may be going and meeting with people at the plant. I mean, I've been there, I've met, but you know, I'm working with Surfrider Foundation. You guys familiar with them? Surfrider Foundation, one of the largest excuse me, international organizations protecting the ocean. They're headquartered in San Clemente. They're awesome, and they're on it. They're involved, and so I just met with them Friday. And we're talking about, you know, what can we do together to you know, try to push. And one of the things we're trying to do is, well, look, Edison doesn't want this. They want out of it. So let's at least try to keep the dialogue going with them rather than, you know, just fighting them, and see if there's a plan that we can put together to take this up to Newsom and get it done, right? But finding a site's a big deal. Yes?
Considering there is spent
Yep,
fuel.
yep.
How long was the projected useful life of each nuclear power plant? Like, they had to have done a cost-benefit analysis or something to say, well, this is going to give us energy for X amount of years,
Yeah.
therefore the risk will be
Yeah.
okay, because by the time that time rolls around, technology will have evolved and we'll know what to do with it.
Yeah.
But how long was it, because they haven't been in service for that long.
No.
Just to be paying this big of a price, it doesn't seem like they provided energy for a very long period of time.
Well, that's true. There's also the argument now being put out by more and more advocates for environment that we really should not be focusing on nuclear and that we should be doing renewables, which, you know, I'm kind of on board with that. So, you know, there's been a lot of pushback. Having said that, I think there's still plans for 2, 3, or 4 more plants to be implemented in the country right now.
How long were their lifespans?
Yeah, I don't know the actual answer to that. I do know that some plants were not open that long. I've got a flyer on.
Because it's less than 50 years.
If you got the flyer, the handout on the history of the nuclear industry over there, that says that, you know, there was a plant that the first plant that opened up, and it was only open for 20 years or something. I mean, I don't understand why. So I don't think there's been one set, you know, thing. Clearly, you get the sense on all of this that there was not solid planning going on any of this, you know, in terms of the end. It was, how can we generate this industry? How can we get this thing going? And I mean, you know, yeah, we'll solve the problem later, and just it's now on us. And, you know, frankly, here's the reality, is that there's a lot of people that honestly don't believe we can move this stuff, that it's stuck there. Greg ASCO is the so on the Mike Levin task force. It's headed by 2 pretty solid individuals. Greg ASCO is one, and he's a former head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This is a book that he's written called Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator. It's pretty good. He don't believe it's, you know, we're ever going to get it out of there, honestly, you know. So that's just not okay. You know, that's not okay to the surfers at San Onofre, one of the best beaches in the world. That's not okay to us, you know, especially if we find out through this risk assessment that we actually do have an issue here, you know, that something really bad could happen if something happened to this, you know, the canisters, there was an explosion, whatever, and this radiation did get out. Yeah.
But if the taxpayers spent billions on the upper class,
Yep.
why can't we use that?
It's political. It's mainly political. Yeah.
Are any of the other nuclear sites going to be able to use that site? Just
Nope. No. Nevada said nobody can use. Nobody. We don't want it. Right. Yeah. So you've got a federal government states' rights issue going on. One of the problems in that Blue Ribbon Commission that happened, one of the big problems I have with it is they came up with this politically correct policy that said, we'll only find a site if the area around it consents. It's got to be consent-based. Yeah. And I'm like, wait a minute. Where was our consent? We're sitting here with the worst possibly located of 100 sites in the country, and where did we have consent on that? And where's our, you know, why is that okay? And you're talking about a site with 1,000 people around it, and they're not consenting, and you're saying no? I mean, no. So again, I'm arguing that Gavin Newsom has a right for eminent domain. He was going to put a bullet train, right, through, and, you know, we can use eminent domain. I think it's the same thing for this. We have to look at the greater good and say, you know, where's the best possible place in California that we can put this, and let's go get that done. Even if it takes 10, 20 years, it's going to be better for our kids and our, you know, other generations, right? Yeah. Yeah.
What happened to the whistleblower?
I'm not sure.
We have a
He was,
president
he,
that says they should be executed.
yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. I don't think he got fired, but I think as an OSHA contractor, I think he wasn't there for long, but I don't think he's there anymore, and I'm not sure what happened to him. Yeah, I need to find out. Yeah, it's a good question, but man, we all really do owe him a lot. Yes, sir.
I'm not an advocate of hiding things from the public, but I can imagine what would happen if the city or the county said, well, you know, this is a much bigger risk than we have, and we're going to be working on it for the next 20 years. I think that nobody, probably San Clemente would be a desert town, and Southern California, Southern Orange County would probably, the decrease in homes would probably be extremely substantial.
Real estate industry does not want to get into this issue.
It's an if, you know.
They do not.
It is an if. We don't know.
It is an if. Yeah.
50 years, 100 years, 200 years. The
Right.
canisters are rated for
Right.
17, but
Yeah.
we don't know. Does that mean, that probably doesn't mean they're going to completely fall apart at 18 years old, right?
Well, the issue isn't them falling apart as much as it is saltwater contamination and the water getting in. If there are cracks, they're not inspectable cans, right? So we don't know if there's cracking that is occurring. We don't know. And the radiation detection piece is critical. So this guy, Mark Demons, that I mentioned then at UC San Diego, and his efforts to get these devices installed and operating, he needs money, right? And I just met him last week, and he was kind of making a plea. I got to pull the plug on this project unless I can get some more funds. I think we might have connected him to somebody that's going to help on that, which is critical. We have to have good radiation detection as step one of emergency planning, right? I mean, you have to have that.
Dave, even to
Yeah.
mention emergency planning to
Yeah.
a community is detrimental to the entire community.
That's why they all want to just avoid it.
Well, do you
But you got a similar thing going on with coronavirus a little bit, you know?
The best possibility might be to have the government take care of this in secret. I know that's never going to happen.
I wouldn't mind at all if they would do it, but they're not doing it, right? I mean, it just keeps getting pushed. Yeah. Yes, sir.
David, I'm going to ask you this question.
Yeah.
In the overall scheme of things, this plant is not that old,
Right.
right? It's
Right.
not even 100 years.
No.
Right?
Right.
And before Southern California Edison went in and invested billions of dollars in building this plant,
Yep.
and it may be public money because it's a public utility company.
Yep.
They must have done an environmental impact study on
Yeah.
that. And they must have, a bunch of engineers and scientists must have gone in, looked into it, and said, this is where we're going to locate the plant.
Yeah, the whole issue of how that plant got approved there.
Later,
Yeah.
we're trying to
Yeah.
analyze this and say,
Mhm.
what? No, that's not the,
Yeah.
right?
Bad location.
It's not the worst place.
Yeah, bad location. Yeah. Yeah.
How would stuff like that happen?
You know, I don't have the answer to that. I wish somebody could answer that. Anybody have an answer for that? Yeah.
No answer, but it has become more populated. It was less populated back then.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
But still doesn't excuse
Yeah, I mean, it used to be just only Nixon's White House right down there, San Clemente. You know, yeah, nothing else was down there, right? Yeah, it's true. You know, I mean, it just, I think it's a good picture of how things really get done often, you know, behind our backs in government, why it's so important for awareness, why it's so important for us all to be engaged and understanding what's really happening. You know, without, I really have tried to keep a balance of not falling in with all of the sky's falling advocates, you know, that's like screaming, you know, everywhere and because we don't know, but I'm concerned. And if we don't, if we think that there's, you know, a bad thing that could happen, it just doesn't make any sense to bury your head in the sand to me. You know, I think we got to find out, we got to get to the bottom of it and take proper precautions. You know, if we don't know, if you don't know what the potential risk is, then it's not wise to plan for the best case. It's wise to plan for the worst case, right?
Most
So,
plants are, located near a water source.
yeah,
And for the, because you need a cooling system.
yeah,
To keep the rods cool.
right,
And having said that,
yeah,
we've had, in the history of nuclear power plants, we've had 3 accidents basically.
Right.
so to speak of.
right,
One in the United States.
Yeah.
One in Russia that,
Right.
really knows what happened.
right,
And, the
And
third one
Fukushima.
was a natural disaster.
uh-huh,
If there wasn't an earthquake or tsunami,
Right.
that plant would still be operating.
right. And those were all active live plants.
Yeah.
Not nuclear waste, right?
So we haven't had any accidents,
Right.
so to speak of,
Right,
which doesn't mean that there will not be an accident. tomorrow,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah, it's a risk equation.
It is it really an unsafe industry? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe it is a safer. We have industrial accidents all the time.
When I mean, I understand and I hear the point, but I think when you look at the potential damage of plutonium and uranium and cesium and these elements that very few of us really know anything about, other than that we know that with X-rays and other things there's warnings around them, and there's plenty of information. I've got a whole set of information up here about the effects of radiation on the body, right? So we know that that it's got damaging effects. So it's got huge potential damage. The issue is, how likely are we to be exposed to it, and for it. That's what we don't really know for sure yet. But I think the chances are good. Hopefully, the risk assessment will give us a much better sense from some pretty top flight scientists that will bump that risk factor up a bit and give us a much better awareness around it. But yeah, you're right. We could be lucky. I use an analogy of Russian roulette with a gun. Clint Eastwood, and are you lucky? I mean, you got one loaded bullet, right, and the others are blanks. And I mean, do you feel lucky? That's it. Anything else? Yes.
What did they do with the Hanford decommissioning? I think it's a toxic superfund or something.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about Hanford other than that I know that there's been concern around it. I don't know if they had leaks around it. I'm not sure, but there must have been something because there's been a lot of noise about Hanford.
That's another nuclear site?
Nuclear site in Washington? Yeah, Washington. So, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I think so. And this is another thing. I mean, this is why it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Corona thing. I mean, you just don't know how much impact it can have on you, right? In this case, I mean, Corona could kill you. That's pretty bad. This could kill you too. But if you look at some of these reports on the impact of what cells can have on body systems, I mean, they can alter your DNA. I mean, they can affect your organs. They can, there's a lot that can happen if you get too much exposure. I mean, it doesn't have to happen from nuclear. It's any radiation coming from sources if you're too exposed. So, yeah, it's not something you want to, be around all the time. I certainly wouldn't want to be a worker at the plant, with the kind of protections that they don't really seem to have. Yes, sir.
Yeah, in my opinion, viewing just the danger of nuclear is not quite fair. Just like viewing the danger of automobiles on a street is not fair.
Mm-hmm.
What one needs to really to evaluate is the ratio of benefit to the danger.
Yep.
Cars are very dangerous.
Right.
Still, we think the benefit outweighs the danger. The same question has to be asked about nuclear plant. We think the significant dangerous.
Uh-huh. I hear you. And I think there's some validity to that. I mean, but again, I often say life is a game of musical chairs, and I mean, how, are you lucky? You're going to stay lucky. And do we want to increase our odds of getting in a chair or decrease them, Yeah.
You should stop building cars as well.
Well, cars aren't the safest things, right? I mean, cars are pretty tough. Yeah.
Well, I think the main issue is that we don't know what to do with the waste.
Right.
We don't have a waste disposal system.
Right. Right.
So the comparison to cars is not fair. And
Yeah.
the short-lived, like I was looking up the San Onofre thing.
Yeah.
It says they started building it in 1964.
Yeah.
And it went online in 68, but they closed it by 92. And now we're left with this mountain of stuff that's going to be around for 100,000 years or longer.
Right.
That could potentially kill
Right.
everybody within a very... So the comparison isn't just the
Yeah.
same. And cars have evolved to be converted, and now we're looking at renewables that make them safer.
Yep.
We have no direction. This has been going on for 50
Long time.
50 years, and we
Yep.
have no direction on how do we dispose of this.
It's true.
Our animals don't poop and sleep in the same place.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
we've had problems
Yeah.
with housing areas being
Yep.
built on top of landfills and
Yep.
then methane. And so what are you going to do with this type of waste? I think so that's the issue.
There was a recent report that came out from a worldwide body of activists looking at nuclear waste. I think, again, it should be on the Samuel Lawrence site. And it was just looking at the state of affairs, of storage of nuclear waste. What's everybody doing? Is there a best practice out there? Where are we? And it was basically saying, we don't have this figured out. You know, even storing it deep into the earth in containers isn't necessarily 100% foolproof. I don't think anything's going to be 100% foolproof. But I think we can just try to limit our risk as much as possible. We have to lower our risk as much as possible. There's a cost-benefit, obviously, analysis. But if you look at $13 trillion impact, you know, I mean, back in my day when we were selling emergency preparedness to, you know, CEOs of companies, I mean, you know, telling them that they were going to lose millions of dollars an hour was kind of all they needed to say, okay, I guess it's worth several $1 million of an investment, right? We're talking about, you know, just a smidgen of an investment into the proper emergency planning, into better containers, into, you know, whatever it is, whatever it's going to take to get this thing off the worst possible site that it's at, and at least into a better location. So, yeah. Yes.
You know, you mentioned Bill Gates.
Yep.
He invested in a
Yeah.
company called TerraPower.
Yep.
And the concept of this reactor they're working on
Yeah.
is they're using waste actually
Yes.
as fuel for
Reusable waste. Yeah. And I think there's some hope there. I think the science offers us some hope in trying to figure out how can we either decompose this waste, how can we maybe, you know, the fuel rods themselves are full of a range of nuclear elements. Some are really highly, you know, deadly, and others aren't. There's terms for that. You know, high level radiation versus lower level. And it would be great to be able to really just separate out the lower level forms and find ways to either dispose of it or do something different with that, and really only have to worry about just the high level, you know, waste. So, and maybe there's a way to reuse it. But my understanding of reusable waste is that even if you're able to do that, at some point, it's still going to have residue. You're going to have some nuclear waste residue you still got to deal with. So, I mean, you're just kicking the can down the road a little bit, you know, as part of the problem. In my view, nuclear itself is just not a good thing. You know, it's not a good thing. It's something we I don't think need anymore. I think renewables can get us there. I think we need to invest like crazy into renewables. And why are we wanting to continue with this completely damaging, you know, material? I just don't get it.
Well, we're still fracking. Why don't we just pump it underground?
Yeah.
The fracking toxins.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, there are proposals to fundamentally do that, to you know, shoot it into these little crevices, basically, into the earth. You know, and then what are we going to do? You know, so yeah. Anything else? Yes, sir. And we'll.
One reason could be to invest in nuclear. That could be the fastest solution to mitigate the climate change.
No, it's definitely, that's a positive in a way, because it doesn't eliminate the kind of, you know, emissions that coal and other, you know, energy does. But my understanding is that we don't need it. Like right now, for San Onofre, we don't need it. You know, I mean, we're able to get enough electricity.
That's because we're depending on fossil fuels. If we want to get rid of fossil fuels, we need something.
Well, we need something.
And renewables.
We need renewables. Yeah.
If the wind isn't blowing or if the sun isn't shining,
Yeah.
it's not producing electricity.
Yeah.
So we need something tied
Something else.
during those periods.
Yeah.
And that's why
it's still there. Yeah.
There's a lot of things happening with energy storage, especially in other countries.
Yep.
Water's being used in 2 different lakes. Also, there's a new robo builder that builds a building using robot cranes, and they build it during the day, and then they disassemble it using the gravity lowering down these huge blocks. They're 10-ton blocks. They kind of come together like a Lego, but it's 40 foot by 20 by 20 foot Lego, and there's several models now that are being looked at. That would be pretty much free energy, just the cost of the unit's about $10 million. So a lot less expensive than nuclear power. Dave, before you go, I wanted to ask about type 2. Type 2 nuclear power is much safer. And there's 2 reactors in Georgia being built with 2 different companies. And type 2 reactors all over France that are much less vulnerable with their nuclear waste.
Yeah, so those sound like safer plants than what we've had. And that's great. But you still have the issue of the waste. You know,
well, the waste is burnable.
I don't think it all is. I think there's
much more than it is than the spec 1.
So that needs to be better understood. You know, that needs to be better understood. If the answer is that it can take care of, knead up all the waste and there's no waste, then great. Then, you know, there's some level of risk still, but far, far less. So that's good if we need it. I'm not sure that we need it. I'd love to see us, you know, as I said, you know, doing the renewables. But anyways, I'm going to, you know, if anybody has more questions or anything else, I'll be around. And this information up here, feel free to browse it. And then if you want any of it, I'm happy to send it to you. And again, please sign up if you'd like more or if you'd want to be involved. But thanks again for your attention and for being here. Thanks. Thanks.